An unexpected and very strange occurrence took place in 1950, which brought into question the beliefs of many and even shook up the medical establishment. Dr. Giuseppe Stoppoloni was a professor of anatomy at the University of Camerino in Italy, as well as a reputable physician and psychologist. He was also an avid researcher into spiritualism and actually conducted some classes on the occult. In September 1950, as part of a discussion on mediums, the professor introduced local medium Maria Boccia to the students. She sank into a trance and was soon speaking in recognisable voices of deceased relatives known to those present, as well as passing along information relevant to some of them. But towards the end of the séance, Maria suddenly began to sound frantic, and the voice of another, who was near hysterical, replaced her own. The drop-in communicator begged the group to have mercy and listen, announcing herself as a Rosa Manicelli, who was Rosa Spandoni when she passed. She said that her husband had predeceased her and that both were in the cemetery at Castel Raimondo, just a few miles away. The spirit Rosa said she was asking only that the group help others because her experience could happen to them. She said that 2 days after her death certificate was signed, she had been taken to the cemetery in a deep coma and buried alive. At this point, the medium Maria collapsed and the communicator was gone as the students sat in shocked silence. The bizarre communication inspired Professor Stoppolini to investigate its authenticity. He searched for evidence of the deceased at the courthouse, at the municipal offices, and in other public records, but initially found nothing to confirm the woman called Rosa had existed. However, finally, from the archives of the Camerino Hospital, he discovered that a certain Rosa Manicelli, widow of Spandoni, had died in the Civil Hospital of Camerino on September 4, 1939, at the age of 38. Cause of death was given as puerperal infection and cardiac complications. Her body had been buried on September 6, 1939, in Tomb 10, Field 47, in the Castel Raimondo Cemetery. With apparently no surviving relatives to protest against her exhumation, on September 13, 1950, a small group gathered by Rosa's grave. It included the students and their professor, the medium, a photographer, 2 hired workmen, a pathologist sent by the Camerino Board of Health, and 2 Italian government officials. If what Maria had related were true, it would offer convincing proof of the survival phenomenon. After an hour of digging, the coffin was unearthed, and Professor Stoppolini personally descended into the grave to assist with its opening. When the coffin lid was removed, the onlookers were met with a gruesome sight. The skeleton within was leaning to the left rather than flat on its back, its left arm bent upwards and fingers thrust into the mouth and throat cavity. The knees were bent as if in an effort to force open the lid, and, even worse, there were parallel rows of scratches on the inside of the lid and coffin sides where the unfortunate woman had tried to claw her way out. The spirit's claim of having been buried alive was confirmed. This led to the pathologist issuing a public statement about the incident and expressing astonishment as to how Maria Boccia had obtained the information. However, the official pathology report read that it was completely irrelevant to know how Professor Stoppolini had come to his awareness of the facts. The pathologist stated that they were forced to agree with him that Rosa Spandoni was buried while she was in a coma due to the absence of perceptible signs of life, and that by the time she awoke in the coffin, it was too late to succour her. According to one source, the case and its conclusions were published in various journals, and it was also the subject of heated discussions at a political level. Some researchers have tried to verify the accuracy of this incredible account, with the identities of the professor and deceased person definitely confirmed. One researcher contacted a Camerino local who stated that there were some people ready to swear accounts of the incident were true, although none was a direct witness. 4 years after the discovery, Edmund P. Gibson wrote in Fate magazine about the experimental séance arranged by Dr. Giuseppe Stoppellini, who was described as a physician and psychologist of considerable reputation. Gibson's research verified details about Rosa's maiden name and her residency in the town of Castel Raimondo, as well as her presumed death and burial. He found that permission for her exhumation had been readily granted the professor by the local authorities, mainly due to the expiry of the time for her occupation of a cemetery grave. In Italy, this is limited by law, and after the expiration date for the grave, the remains are removed at some stage by the custodian of the cemetery, then usually placed in a common burial location. The Fate magazine researcher found that Professor Stoppellini had examined the local burial records carefully and confirmed that Mrs. Spandoni had passed at the Civil Hospital of Camerino on September 4, 1939, at the age of 38 years. The recorded cause of her death was confirmed as puerperal infection with subsequent heart involvement, and that her body was interred on September 6, 1939, in grave 10, line number 47. 2 Italian government officials and even the photographer were specifically named and identified as being present at Rosa's disinterment, and the state of the casket and remains, reflecting the frenzy of the occupant, described in great detail. The evidence of the grave had confirmed every detail in the communication from Rosa Menicelli Spandoni at the séance, and was said to have profoundly shocked all the witnesses of the exhumation. Mrs. Spandoni had obviously not died in the Camerino hospital, but probably been in a coma or condition of catalepsy when certified as deceased, and had survived for 2 days in that state. Terrifyingly, she had awoken in her coffin to find herself sealed from the outside world. Apparently she had left behind 4 children. According to Gibson, Professor Stoppelloni then began a campaign in Italy to enforce more thorough examination of the deceased prior to burial. The professor's research subsequently found that accidental burial of living persons through carelessness was still occurring in Italy, France, England, and the United States. His campaign was described as bringing immediate support from many newspapers in Italy and gratitude from Rosa in a subsequent séance held on September 16, 1950. During this, she is said to have thanked the circle of investigators for their actions and their striving towards the prevention of future tragedies like hers. She asked that they continue and redouble their efforts to this end. According to one source, the outraged public reaction that had followed revelations of her horrific end rocked Italy and even threatened to bring down the government of the day. Within months, Professor Stoppelloni had succeeded in his crusade for more scrupulous medical assessment and monitoring of the recently deceased. As the story became known in other European countries, burial practices there were also hastily changed. Gibson stated in his article that Professor Stoppelloni's campaign to prevent burial of the living appeared to be gaining ground in Italy, writing optimistically that Rosa Spandoni's communication had caused a change in burial practices that might save many lives. This seems to have been Rosa's wish in contacting the medium. Her second achievement, the incisive proof of survival she has demonstrated to the world.